Why is Homer so complex and still historians say he was a household phenomenon? Are we just dumb? We may well just be dumb, but there's also some kind of historical stuff going on here. Hi, I'm Anna Cargill-Martin. I am a classicist and an ancient historian, and today I'm answering the questions that you sent me about Homer and the Odyssey. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm so excited to get into these. We are going to split this into two, and so today we're going to look mainly at who is Homer, how were the poems created, what is the context in which they're being written, and then in the next video we'll look more about the historical world that Homer is writing about. Was Homer a real person? This is a huge question. It's often referred to as the Homeric question, and it's been engrossing and troubling scholars and readers of the Iliad and the Odyssey ever since the ancient world. The general scholarly consensus at the moment is that the Iliad and the Odyssey come out of this huge, rich, very long oral tradition that had been developing for hundreds of years before they are written down in the form that we know today at some point in the second half of the 8th or very early 7th century BC. But scholars also generally agree that both the Iliad and the Odyssey, in the kind of extraordinary and coherent form that we find them today, owe a great deal to a singular poet. Probably, interestingly, a different poet for the Iliad and for the Odyssey. This individual synthesized all these elements of this grand poetic tradition, gave us the stories in the form that we know them, created these new works essentially of individual genius building on this long tradition. And they're doing so, luckily, at a time that writing is being reintroduced into the Greek world after the Dark Ages. And so it's possible for their work to be recorded and preserved in its original kind of crystallized form. But I will use Homer to refer to the person and kind of traditions that produced the Iliad and the Odyssey for the rest of this video because it is just so much easier. Was it originally an oral piece of poetry, song, performed and not read? So I think there are actually kind of two questions here. Firstly, were the poems composed by Homer through speaking or through writing? And then how were they used in the early years of their existence? So for the first one, Homer is clearly a poet who is trained in and an expert in and coming out of the oral tradition. And we can see that in the rhythm of his poetry, in the way that he uses language and kind of constructs the parts of his verses. There is much more scholarly debate over the role that writing is playing, if any, in the composition of his work. He's writing at a moment in which writing is being reintegrated into Greek life, and some scholars argue that, as well as composing a lot of his verses through performance, Homer was also using writing as a tool to write and edit the work. Others argue that the work is composed entirely orally, and then it is either written down by Homer himself afterwards, who wants to preserve his masterpieces for posterity, or it's transcribed by someone who is essentially watching him. And then in terms of how those poems are being experienced by their early audiences, again, there is going to be a mixture of performance and writing. The recitation of literary works is a massive way in which they're disseminated right into the classical period of Greek history. And there are loads of occasions on which a poem like the Odyssey might have been performed. There are recitations during religious festivals, and it's possible that in some of those instances, the Odyssey is being recited in full, which would have taken 3 days. But they had better attention spans than us. More commonly, you're probably getting recitations like the ones that we actually read about in the Odyssey, where there is a bard who is being invited to an elite dinner and he is there to entertain the guests. And he's going to perform a section of the poem, sometimes possibly in response to something that the audience is requesting. On quite a few occasions in the Odyssey, we see audience members asking a bard to recount a particular episode. In terms of the way in which the text is being performed and whether it's being sung, that is actually shifting over time. So during the kind of the Dark Ages and probably the Mycenaean Palace period, bards are singing their poetry as far as we can tell. But that seems to be going somewhat out of fashion by the Homeric age, and there is now more of an emphasis on rhythm and kind of chanting in recitation, and also in the performance of feeling and character, there's a group of people called rhapsodes. It's a wonderful Greek word. It means something like song stitcher. They very often don't compose their own work, but they have memorized the works of the great poets, and their skill lies in the performance of passages of those works. And there are even competitions for those performances in the Greek world. Do you think Homer was a man, woman, or multiple people? So I think we've kind of covered the one person versus multiple people, but the woman question is really interesting. So some scholars have argued that because Homer has a remarkable ability to write female characters and to get into the minds of the women that he's writing, he must have been a woman, or there must have been kind of women who contribute to the group of works that Homer is drawing on. I don't know that I buy that. I think firstly, that's very harsh on male writers. Like a lot of men are perfectly capable of writing a good female character. Also, perhaps more importantly, we have no evidence of female poets writing epic poetry of the sort that Homer's writing in the Archaic period. We have a couple maybe being referenced from later periods, from the kind of 4th, 3rd century BC onwards. But in the Archaic period, all of our references to epic poets or to epic bards performing this sort of work are men. We do have evidence of women writing poetry and singing songs from the period. So Sappho is a lyric poet who is writing at the end of the Archaic period. She is incredibly famous and respected throughout Greece. But that is a different type of poetry. We also have a lot of interesting evidence from within the Odyssey itself of women kind of using song to tell stories in different contexts. So there are a lot of references to women singing whilst they weave. So there clearly are these poetic and performative traditions that women are engaging in. So the oral tradition that Homer is working with was doubtless also influenced by women, either by women writing other forms of poetry and song, or simply by women being in the audience and maybe requesting different episodes or encouraging certain poets to explore certain themes. But I think Homer himself, as far as he is an individual, has to be a man. Why is Homer so complex and still historians say he was a household phenomenon? Are we just dumb? We may well just be dumb, but there's also some kind of historical stuff going on here. We have to remember that the Iliad and the Odyssey were texts that were absolutely everywhere in the ancient world, and they were kind of filtered through all sorts of different mediums. And so people would have come to know about them and engaged with them on all sorts of different levels. These are texts that are forming the absolute foundations of the classical education system, even at really quite an elementary level. And so these are levels of education. Obviously, they're absolutely not accessible to everyone, but they are accessible well beyond the elite. Greece and later Rome are remarkably literate societies by the standards of the ancient world. And Homer is really the foundational text. And so a lot of people who had some level of education would have encountered Homer at school. There are these amazing papyri from Egypt that are essentially reading comprehension texts based on Homer. And even if you were entirely illiterate, there were hundreds of ways that you could encounter Homeric stories and even Homeric vocabulary in your everyday lives. Homer also, in a way that's quite similar to Shakespeare, really, really works his way into the language. And so a lot of cliches, I suppose, or popular maxims come from verses of Homer. So even if people aren't hearing the whole poem, or even if they can't read, they probably are encountering Homeric language just in the course of their everyday conversation. So people are literally being raised on this stuff, and that means that the texts are very familiar to them, they're not intimidated by them, they have this baseline level of knowledge. People are also going to be aided in understanding the text by the way in which they're encountering them very often. So if people are hearing the texts rather than reading them through recitation, they're going to be aided by the performer. The job of the rhapsode is really to interpret the text and convey its meaning to the people to whom he's reciting. He's doing that through voice, through gesture, through rhythm, through pause, through characterization. And that's really going to help you in understanding what he's saying. You also have this kind of visual world of Homer that again is going to help you understand what you're hearing or reading. The Homeric stories have such a massive impact on the material culture of the ancient world. You might well see episodes from the Homeric stories carved into the side of your temples, or in paintings in public galleries, or on a much more mundane level, people would very often have scenes or characters from the Iliad or the Odyssey painted onto the vessels that they used in their everyday life, onto the jugs that they collected water in, or the cups that they drank out of, or the little boxes that they used to hold their jewelry or cosmetics. And so people are totally surrounded by imagery of these stories as well. And very often also on the pottery, there's this amazing tendency to almost treat the narratives in a comic book-like way. Characters will sometimes have little labels telling you who they are, or they will have even speech bubbles. So you are really encountering these stories from a whole ton of different sources, all of which are kind of aiding your understanding of them in different ways. I think it's helpful to think about Homer as playing a very similar function to the one that Shakespeare or the Bible might have played in the West a couple of hundred years ago. So most people are going to have some level of familiarity with it. But then there is a whole spectrum of how far and how deeply people are actually engaging with the content. There is a group of people in the ancient world who are doing really, really serious scholarly study on Homer. They're working with the text, they're trying to work out what the visual imagery is, or how the text has been constructed, or to think about the historical events it might be referring to, or even to reconstruct the biography of Homer himself. And they are essentially academics. But most people aren't engaging with the text in that way. They are treating this as a great story. Who was the Odyssey aimed at? Was it popular entertainment or just for the elite? So this is kind of connected to the last question. But I think what is interesting is that Homer is definitely reflecting a lot of the interests and values and concerns of the archaic aristocracy. So things like honor, things like guest relationships, these are aristocratic issues. That doesn't mean that there are not elements in the poems that speak to a whole host of other groups. I think one of the amazing things about the Iliad and the Odyssey is how richly Homer characterizes and humanizes other groups of people, so slaves or women. And I think that that is actually one of the things that has made these poems so enduring, because it's very easy for any person really to find something to relate to and understand in the Odyssey, even though we don't have the same values or interests or concerns as an aristocrat in 790 BC. In terms of who they are aimed at and who it's kind of entertainment for, again, it's going to be a whole host of people, even if it's a recitation at an elite dinner. Although the elite male guests are the intended audience, they're not the only people who are listening to the poem. It's also going to be heard by all the servers, all the entertainers, any women who are present, or maybe prostitutes who've been invited. There's a scene in the Odyssey where Penelope kind of hears the bard from up in her own rooms and calms down and stops him reciting something that is reminding her of Odysseus and making her unhappy. So the question of intended audience is slightly different from the question of who is being entertained by it. And I think the entertainment is actually much more widely diffused, particularly then when you get into a later period and it's become so foundational for culture and people are encountering it from all these different media. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I would love to know what you think about any of this in the comments. And obviously, if you subscribe, I will love you forever.